on. So you'll get a more in-depth understanding of how different people interpret their research in different ways. So what is qualitative research? As I said, it's extremely difficult to define, and it's probably not a helpful term, even though we use it all the time, and we use it mainly to differentiate the sort of research we do in this area from quantitative research. But because it doesn't have one definitive meaning, it's probably far better to ask why we do qualitative research. Not what it is, but why we would do this sort of inquiry. First assumption that qualitative researchers hold to is that our realities exist in different ways. So different people, and we know that, we all know that, so different people will interpret the world in quite different ways. There isn't just one reality out there and we just need to capture that, but there are a range of realities. People interpret their lives and the worlds they live in quite different ways. So let me give you an example. Has anybody here heard of Anawadi? It's an interesting settlement that sits near the airport in Mumbai, in India, and it's a settlement of about 3,000 people, and the people earn their living by going through the garbage of the people who stay in international hotels. And Catherine Boo, a person called Catherine Boo, who writes for the New Yorker magazine, the US magazine, the New Yorker, did an ethnographic study of this community. And I really like this example because what Catherine Boo shows us, that there are different ways to look at this situation of Anawadi. It's at first glance, it's a fairly horrific, the living conditions are fairly horrific. This is sewerage that runs through the settlement, and people, yes, obviously live in very poor situations. So at first glance, yes, it looks grim, very grim. But what Catherine Boo did, she spent about 18 months, maybe more, maybe 2 or 3 years there, on and off, living with the people in Anawadi and talking to them and getting to know them really well. And basically what her research shows us is that people in situations such as this, in dire situations such as this, are not passive people, but they work really, really hard and actively to construct some sort of meaning about their lives and to construct some sort of normality about their lives. And so we see a picture of Anawadi children at school, and they look like children from any classroom anywhere in the world, really. This picture doesn't really fit with the previous picture of the shanty town, but the people, the adults in Anawadi, have ambition for their children, and they want their children to be educated, and they want their children to move out of this situation. I don't want to romanticise it because their living conditions are horrific, and no one should have to live in that situation. But it's the interesting point is that Catherine Boo looked at this sort of social community, or this sort of social world, from the micro level, so looking at how people interact and how people construct their own social world through those interactions. And she also looked at this sort of situation from the macro level, so looking at how people came to be in this situation where they were living off the garbage the garbage deposited by people in international hotels. Her book is called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and what she means, there was a big billboard. You drove from the airport towards Anawadi, there were big billboards advertising very fine and very expensive Italian tiles, and just behind those billboards this community lived, and so she called it Behind the Beautiful Forevers. It's a lovely title. But yes, as I say, the point to make is that there are a number of different ways we could interpret this situation. We could look at it and say, well, this is terrible, which it is, but if we have if we bring an inquiring eye and if we come to understand how people actually survive and live and construct their lives in this situation, then it can tell us something about different social worlds and how human beings are social actors in those worlds. It's a lovely example. Another interesting example, which I find fascinating, I've heard about it for a long time, but it's being spoken about this week. I'll say why. But this is the largest refugee camp in the world, and it sits on the border on the eastern side of Kenya, the border of Somalia and Kenya. It was opened in 1991 when there was a war in Somalia, and about 500,000 people live here and have lived here since that time. And I was just reading yesterday about a young man who was born here in 1996 and did his education at this refugee camp and grew up, obviously, and he's now going off to university. So it's fascinating. Again, I don't want to romanticise it because people who live in refugee camps live in hopeless situations or lack of hope, situations where there's a lack of hope, and of course their living conditions are very poor. But nonetheless, interesting example of how we can study a social group and how we can come to understand how they make sense of their lives and how they work actively to construct some sort of life there. The Kenyan government, it's been in the news this week because the Kenyan government wanted to shut down the refugee camp, but it's just been to the Supreme Court in Kenya, and the Supreme Court said no, they couldn't shut it down. I mean, what would you do with 500,000 displaced people? And many of these people were looking forward to moving to the United States, but of course that option at the moment is not open to them. It's been cut off by the Trump government. So if you go into communities such as refugee camps like this, you'll see that people set up businesses and that there are schools and that there is a semblance of a community, and people have to work very hard to construct that community. So again, if you look, if we look at that, the refugee camp, from this perspective, then we may be interested in the broad structures, the political structures and the broad social structures that have given rise to this sort of camp. But if we go into the camp and observe the people in the camp and look at the way that they're living each day, then we come to understand something else about these people as social actors. And it's not the sort of research that we could do. We can certainly count people, but they're not the sort of research or the sort of that we can do quantitatively, not the sort of insight that we could gain if we did quantitative research. And so it demonstrates the value of doing some qualitative research in these situations. So two great examples. Not my example, not great because I chose them, but two great examples. And so, yes. Oh, interrupt any time, please. I love being interrupted. Oh, it's recording. It says red, but red means it's going. Oh, yeah, no, recording. Okay. Only one question? Oh, you have access to PowerPoint, yes. Yep. Two questions, yes. Recording and yes. No, that's fine. What's that? It's a free country. You can ask as many questions as people want. That's right. You can ask as many questions as you want. Lots of questions. David Silverman, anything David Silverman writes is really, really good. He writes writes textbooks and writes other books about qualitative research and writes articles, and I like all his work. But this is a lovely little book. It's a very short, fairly interesting and reasonably cheap book about qualitative research. And I say that because this is where I got these photos from. David Silverman tells us that what qualitative research is about looking at the complexities in the appearance of the mundane. So taking the ordinary everyday life and looking for the complexities within that ordinary day life. Looking for the complexities within the appearance. So taking a picture of a young girl looking out the back window of a car and the father in the front and looking for the complexities, asking the question, what's going on here? the complexities in the appearance of the mundane. And conversely, alternatively, looking for the mundane in a complex world. So looking for, and I think the two examples I gave you was looking for the mundane or the everyday lives in the very, very complex worlds of Anawati and the Kenyan refugee camp. Yeah, a young 3-year-old boy smoking, which was the norm in his context, and a lovely picture there, the young boy and a monkey. So looking for the mundane. So I like both of those, looking for the mundane and complex world, looking for the complexities in the everyday world. So what's studied? Everything's studied in qualitative research. It's interesting to think about, you know, the most influential works that have been published or written over the last 1,000 years, and probably 95% of them would fall under the umbrella heading of qualitative research rather than quantitative research. And it's interesting to think that the word qualitative really only started to be used in about the 1970s and 1980s. And so that was a period when there was a real push to have qualitative research emulate quantitative research, and so qualitative research came to be embedded in courses such as this. But it's interesting to think about that word. The use of that word is very recent, and when we're talking about what it incorporates, we're talking about almost everything that's been studied in the world, apart from randomised control trials, really, RCTs and surveys. So everything can be studied. Actions, language, relationships, meanings that people give to events, social and cultural processes, the political and economic structures that shape the way we live, text, photos, etc., etc., etc. Absolutely anything can be studied from what we call a qualitative perspective. I shouldn't do that. I should ask you, what do you think it is? When you think of the phrase or the term qualitative research, what do you think it means? What do you think it means? Or you knew absolutely nothing about it before you came here today? Yes.
Just a little piece of the puzzle. It has to do with your interpretations of how you see things.
Yep, absolutely. Very good. It is. It's about how we interpret the world, and we can interpret it in a whole lot of different ways. Yep.
So two people can look at the same thing.
Absolutely. Quite differently. And yes, that's right. Really important part. Anybody else?
I was actually thinking of, in terms of qualitative research, like the aesthetics, looking at it from on face value.
Looking at it from face value. Say more. Say not sure.
Same as what she said.
Yep.
In the,
So looking more than face value, absolutely right. I'll say something about that later. But we call that, I don't know whether you've heard the terms manifest and latent. So manifest just refers to what we see on the surface. So we can describe something, but if we're really going to understand what's going on, then we need to understand the latent levels of anything that we're looking at. And the latent level is not what's readily observed, but how we actually interpret it. But you're right, yep.
Research, in a sense, we also looked at as to what things actually mean to people from a point of view of challenge and challenging the status quo of society.
Yeah.
Feminism, perhaps, or when feminism was
yes.
a big deal.
Yes.
Looking at that.
Yeah. So can incorporate interpretive approaches, how people interpret the world in different ways, or it can refer to broad, more critical approaches that challenge the status quo, such as feminism and other approaches. So that's all good points, excellent points. So generally we know that quantitative research is about measuring, and so it's about how much or how many. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is about what's going on here, how is this happening, and why is it happening. So qualitative research is asking and answering quite different questions. often when I ask people to say what they think, what they mean by qualitative research, people say, oh, it's about subjective data, or it's about how people are feeling or how people are thinking. It's really important to make the distinction that qualitative research uses subjective data, but not to understand the subject, but to get a glimpse at something about our social world. So we don't do qualitative research to understand the unique individual or to get inside people's heads or to romanticise about people. It's not about individual attitudes or personal views, but we use that data, whether from interviews or observations or whatever else, so we can draw some conclusions about the social context in which something is happening. Do you get that distinction? Not interested in subjective data as the end, as the answer. We're interested in subjective data for what it can tell us about a social context or a social issue.
Can it also be predictive?
Can it be predictive? Not in a quantitative way, but of course it can. Say more. Have to give me another sentence.
For example, like sometimes when you said not getting into people's heads.
Yes.
So like let's say for example we're looking at a person's psychology, for example, and we understand qualitatively like how this person would behave. Like it could be used as a way of predicting. I'm trying to think of an example for me. It wouldn't ever be, it couldn't be that deterministic. You couldn't determine that because you have come out with these findings in a qualitative study that you can predict this will happen elsewhere. Because, you know, it's not a representative sample. The methods are very flexible and full of holes, so you can't actually draw predictions, but you can draw some theoretical analytical conclusions about something, and that then might inform further research. But predictive, not absolute, I don't think so. Maybe it's your use of the word predictive, I don't know. Maybe your word determinism.
Yeah, no, determinism.
So it's about a little bit like an observation of a group or something, and then if this research has some kind of conclusion, it still can't make a prediction or expectation of a different group where we present the same thing.
So it can't be generalised. It's a very good point, and it's a very grey area because, you know, lots of people argue that if you draw some conclusions about a particular social group or setting, then you should be able to apply those results to similar social groups and settings. But I think it's a very debatable and difficult area.
I must confess I'm a little bit confused what you mean by those last 2 points. So if I was to take in, for example, long-term impacts of institutional use of children.
Yes.
What do you mean by not getting into people's heads and their attitudes and personal
it's not psychology. So it's not about getting into individuals' heads and working out how that individual is working psychologically.
So, I mean, if you're looking at the incidence of depression in people.
Well, if you were looking at the incidence of depression in people, then you'd probably do quantitative research. If you were wanting to understand how people construct meaning around their experience of depression, then you would do qualitative research. But it wouldn't be about psychologising, it would be about coming to understand their experiences of depression as a social phenomenon rather than an individual phenomenon. And so it's not about individual attitudes. So we interview people and say, could you talk about, or could you tell me what you think about? But it's not that we want to know what that individual thinks about, it's just that we want to get a whole lot of data that gives us some insight into this broader issue. I should have said, we sort of start with the assumption, and I'm sure everyone would agree, that we're social beings, so we live in a social world, so we come to develop our ideas through social interaction, and so we have shared of course, we have different views and we have conflicting views, but nonetheless, there is some level of shared views and shared actions, and we're getting a handle on those. Does that answer your question? So, some key questions. Why do it? How is it done? And how is it justified? Which is the hard bit. So you probably know this, but just to draw, I don't want to place too much emphasis on the distinction between quant and qual, but nonetheless, when we're doing quantitative research, we assume that the world is stable, and we assume the world is predictable, as you say. When we're doing qualitative research, we start with the assumption that the world is dynamic, that it can't be readily observed, that it's constantly changing. And so we're never going to be able to grasp the reality of the world. We can only interpret we can only do some interpretation of what's going on. So it's not always knowable, it's not definitively knowable. It's only something that we can interpret. And so similarly, when we talk about the nature of reality from a quant perspective, science is considered neutral. Scientific knowledge is considered neutral knowledge, so it's not social knowledge. And because it's neutral knowledge, scientific knowledge produces facts, produces the truth. A readily observable world. Qualitative research, reality is socially constructed, dynamic and textual, and as I said, not readily knowable. I had a great example of this last week because a PhD student, did you meet Claire at the forum? Yeah. Did she tell you about her ethics? No. Cox. Claire Cox, yeah. A PhD student that I'm supervising, and she sent off her ethics submission to Lady Salento Hospital. And we got a report back that basically said the sample size is not big enough for valid results. The sampling method will produce bias, and the sample's not big enough to produce the truth. Those three things. So I just rang up and made an appointment and went across to see the had a meeting with the chair of the ethics committee. Claire came too, and so we agreed. He was lovely, actually, really dry sense of humour. I talked about, because none of those arguments are applicable to qualitative research. And at the end of the conversation, he just looked at me and said, I think from all the points you've made today, that I can conclude that you think we got it wrong. so we worked out a way. I had to get somebody, and he's going to get an expert, and I had to nominate an expert who would just address those three things about bias, sample size and sampling. He said, anyone but your mother or your sister, so we've done that. But yeah, so it was a really interesting report from an ethics committee. We have to constantly educate. The nature of relationships, quantitative research, the researcher sits outside, again is a neutral instrument in the research and sits outside the research process, and the involvement is controlled. In qualitative research, we don't even talk about bias because we assume that all research is biased. There is no such thing as unbiased research. And so what the researcher brings to the research is a particular point of view and particular values and particular experiences. And so the researcher herself or himself is deemed to be an instrument of research. So we don't, that's why we talk about different interpretations, because we're not all going to see research data in the same way. So the nature of reality and the nature of relationships differs between those two broad approaches. So why do it? Well, we saw from Anuadi and Kenya why we should do it. Here's some nice pictures. It gives us an opportunity to try and understand what is not immediately obvious, which is exactly what you said. Is this photo, won't be for international students probably not familiar, but...
So in the Summer Olympics, I don't know which country, but...
well done.
Jessica, is it? No, not just yes.
Tommy
one of
Smith.
the athletes.
Yeah, Tommy Smith, John
Yeah, and he was not recognised.
Carlos.
Yeah.
Well done. Mexico, Mexico City, 19...
86?
68! 68. 19. From the Summer Olympics 1968, Tommy Smith, John Carlos and Peter Norman, an Australian. Yeah, it was, Tommy Smith and John Lucas chose to make a political stance because it was around the time when African American civil rights they were struggling. So the movement was so large, and Peter Norman, he was only 5'6", and the others. It was amazing that he came third, only as a runner, 5'6". Peter Norman, the Australian, wore a human rights badge and stood in solidarity with the other two. But it tells just a picture, a lovely picture, tells a whole much broader story about political struggle in the United States. Peter Norman then was banned from any other Olympic Games, even though he qualified for the next Olympic Games something like 15 times. He wasn't allowed to go. Terribly sad story. Terribly sad story. He died in 2006, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos came to his funeral and carried his coffin. So, yeah, so that was some. But he never received an official apology for the treatment of the officials. Yeah, it's such a sad story. Somebody was talking about it the other day and said they looked at it on YouTube. It reminded me of it. But just a picture. You can look at it from a whole lot of different perspectives, from the interaction to the event to the broader social and political structures. And I just threw this in because it looked good. Sorry. I know. So everyone would have been aware. This was, I was thinking about, anyway, I'll say it in a minute, but an interesting photo of a fashion show in Milan last week, I think, and all the women are wearing the pink pussy hats do you recognise the hat? Do you recognise the significance of the pink hat? Yeah, the Women's March in America.
I think, yeah, one day after the inauguration.
That's right, after the inauguration, and the women, and worldwide, I think it was something like 4 million women marched, but the pink hat signified their struggle for their rights. But I was thinking about it and thinking, you know, it was used in a fashion show. It was probably used in a fashion show to attract attention. My cynical self, rather than making a political statement, but I don't know that. But we could interpret that. Oh yeah, they probably. Oh yes, I'm sure the people. I'm just saying, I don't know whether it was a political statement or whether it was just a gimmick to get more people to look at those clothes. So it could be either. But yeah. Hey, what's that? Yeah, yeah. So it gives us an opportunity to try and understand what's not immediately obvious, so we have to interpret. It helps us to understand the variety of ways that people interpret the world, not just the researcher, which is nice, so we know that we're going to come to different conclusions. It allows us to understand, interpret it, and influence processes, hopefully, in which we and others participate. So, yeah, lovely photos. I use photos because they're just easy to get, so for no other reason. And talking about different interpretations, and I just put this up because just so people in who are doing public health and whatever else, it's interesting to think about how we interpret health or how we interpret health status. And we see it, and I see it because I review ethics applications. I see it all the time, that there's a remarkable emphasis on lifestyle factors in public health, in health research, that if only people would eat 5 vegetables a day and exercise and lose a bit of weight and whatever, then they would become healthy. So the lifestyle approach, the lifestyle factor approach really dominates. And it's remarkable, isn't it, that when we look at the information from the WHO, and we know from decades of research that
The main determinants of health are general socio-economic, cultural and environmental conditions. Second, living and working conditions. Third, social and community networks. And finally, individual lifestyle factors. So the message is there that lifestyle factors are probably the least important in shaping people's health status. Those other levels are far more important. But we rarely see, or we don't rarely, but we often don't see research on health status extend to those broader or structural issues. So that's just again to say how we interpret our research issues and how we interpret the world in different ways. And this one, of course, says healthy lifestyle choices are more important than income, housing and whatever else. But I think the evidence challenges that seriously. Hello.
I'm here for the qualitative.
You are in the right place. You are in the right place. It might have been difficult to find.
I didn't know where the was.
No, neither did I. But I sent an email, but I don't think it was terribly clear when I practiced this morning. So, this is recorded, so you'll be able to get, you'll be able to listen off Blackboard. Qualitative questions are designed to ask what's going on here. Just sort of like think of those photos. What's going on here? What's the context in which any of this is happening? What's important about this situation? What can we understand? And what variations exist in experience? So they're the sorts of very broad qualitative questions that we would ask. And the best question is, what's going on here? I always say to my students, think about what is going on here. When you're looking at research focus, when you're looking at your data, you just ask the question all the time. What's going on here? How do we do it? Two key elements to qualitative research. And theory, I'll just say, theory just means a coherent, systematic argument. So it's the most difficult part of qualitative research, but all it means is a systematic argument. So theorising is a better word, actually. Theory just refers to the chosen framework for studying a research topic and establishes how we go about the research and is grounded in some clear assumptions. So, and of course quantitative people use theory as well, but it's probably not as critical as in qualitative research. The methods in qualitative research, as you'll come to understand over the semester, are very flexible and there are huge gaps in them. So the rigour in qualitative research is established through theorising, through argument basically, that you are able to put a systematic argument that justifies every element of your research. And the other element, of course, is the methods. And these are really specific research techniques. They're tools. They're the tools that a researcher uses to actually carry out the research. As I said, they're really flexible. And they don't carry a lot of rigour in themselves, but they are useful in generating data. So they may be interviews, observation, photography, focus groups, etc., etc. And of course then the methods of data analysis. So theory, methods, much like all research, I guess. So theory is almost everything in qualitative research, including frustrating, but it's an absolutely necessary burden, and it's the most stimulating part because it gives the researcher a whole lot of flexibility. A lovely thing that I like about qualitative research is that the researcher can interpret a situation. Have to do it rigorously through the application of theoretical ideas, but it means that you've got a great deal of flexibility in how you go about interpreting any situation or any amount of data. So theory is great. And I put theorising. It's a much better word because it means that if we say theory, people think they have to pick up a theory and put it onto the research. Theorising just means ongoing development of argument throughout the research. Anything worth investigating is complex, dynamic and difficult to observe, as we said earlier. So the research depends upon theorising because we can't observe it readily, because we can't grasp a concrete truth out there, then we have to theorise. We have to interpret and theorise.
What's the difference between theorising and hypothesising?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a really good question because there is a blur there. But hypothesis, you state a position up front and you test it out. But having said that, in a lot of research, and particularly critical research, you might state a theoretical argument up front, if it were about gender or if it were about culture or whatever, and then you might test out that argument against the data. So I think you can use the word hypothesis in qualitative research as well as quantitative research. It might mean something slightly different, but I do think it can be used. Theorising, though, is just the development of argument, just an ongoing development of argument and stating of argument. But it's a good point. I think there's probably a debate over it somewhere, but I think you can use hypothesising. The question issue is what theory or what explanation or what ideology, that is political view, does the researcher bring to the study? It's what qualitative researchers need to think about all the time. What particular worldview, and we all have, if I asked you to explain how what you thought the cause of the global financial crisis was, then we'd probably get about 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 different answers here. So we have to be aware of what particular explanation of the world, whatever we're studying, we bring to the study, and we need to think about how that's going to shape the study. Oh, this is the bit that will probably blow you away for a short time. Even though I talk about theorising, you may see by the course outline that this 405 is organised around particular approaches to qualitative research. Just the way that the knowledge area has developed. It's breaking down a bit now, which I think is a good thing, but for numbers of decades, you either were a phenomenologist or grounded theorist or a constructivist or a postmodernist, and certainly those distinctions still apply, but I don't think they're as strongly bounded as they used to be. Nonetheless, our unit is organised around different approaches to qualitative research. We've broken them up into interpretive and critical, simply because most people do, and again, it's blurred, absolutely, and you need to keep that in mind. But we tend to look at interpretive approaches to qualitative inquiry and critical approaches. And so
observing without judgment. Critical is like, this is what is some judgment involved, is it?
Well, it's a very good question, and you put it quite well. So interpretive, traditionally, people have, they don't anymore, most people don't, but traditionally interpretive research has been termed as inductive. That is, you go into the research area and you generate data without actually imposing any predetermined ideas on it. And critical is going into the research with a very clear theoretical argument and testing it out against the data. But most people who I think are any good and write about qualitative research will say there's no such thing as inductive research, because we can't go into research as neutral researchers. We're always bringing some assumptions to that research. But you're correct, and in your reading you'll see how that is posed. But the big difference is, I think it might be the next slide, the big difference is the levels at which interpretive interpretive research addresses and critical research addresses. So, and one way to think about it is that interpretive research looks at the micro-social world and critical research looks at the broader structures, so the macro-social world. So if we're doing interpretive qualitative research, we're interested in how human beings, as social actors, actually interpret their worlds and therefore construct their world. So human beings as social actors interact with other social actors and construct meaning, and through the construction of meaning, so they construct their social worlds. That's the level at which interpretive research works. So, I mean, I often think about this, well, I don't travel a lot, but when I travel to other big cities, and I'm sitting in the hotel looking outside the window and see in the morning and see hundreds of thousands of cars come into a city when everyone's going to work in a relatively orderly manner, and then in the afternoon see all those people leave the city. I think about interpretive research and think about how, hello, that's okay, lost? I'm not. No? Good. So I think about how it is that in that sort of situation, people are active social actors and construct the rules, help to construct the rules, and so help to sustain that order of traffic as it comes in. So the emphasis is on human actions and interactions rather than social structures. I think there's blurring all over now, but generally interpretive research focuses on social interactions. And so grounded theory, phenomenology, hermeneutics, ethnography are examples of qualitative approaches that engage with interpretive. And of course, all of this came about as a bit of a challenge to the idea that we can explain the world purely in terms of economy, politics and broader social structures. So it was a bit of a challenge to that. Critical research, on the other hand, which includes, feminist research, what we call social constructivism or social constructionism, Marxism, critical theory, and other approaches. Big difference is that if you're doing critical research, you pose your theoretical argument up front. So if you're looking at gender, you'd pose your argument about gender up front. That argument would inform your research, but you're basically testing out that argument testing out your data against that argument. So interpretive research, we tend not to theorise, we tend not to pose definitive theories up front, rather we develop theoretical ideas as the research unfolds. But critical research starts with theory and then the research really tests out that theory. So a critical approach includes any sort of political research in all its iterations or forms. Critical research assumes that all knowledge has a political function, so takes on a whole lot of different interests. Feminist research assumes that the most important social organising factor in our world is gender, and so feminists are interested in exploring the gendered world. Discourse analysis, which is very popular in health, but discourse analysis is based on the assumption that power and power relations are produced and reproduced at the level of language. So discourse, of course, refers to language. So a whole lot of researchers that look at language or research language to reveal the power relations that are embedded in that language. So You can look at health policy, for example. It's a good example. You can look at health policy because it's a good example. If you do a discourse analysis of health policy, then you would come to understand the agenda, the political agenda that was informing that health policy. And post-structuralism, postmodernism, basically wants to deconstruct any of the established norms or assumptions that that we take as for granted. So it is easy to think it sits at the macro-social world level. Same thing, assumes that knowledge and language have a political and social function, challenges the status quo, often concerned with inequality and oppression, yes. Rejects the claimed objectivity of quantitative research. The world feels a bit like this at the moment, but yeah. But a critical focus might mean looking at structural processes that shape health and illness. As I said, lifestyle, the focus on lifestyle practices versus structure. There's a sense well, not a sense, but there's quite a dominant discourse in public health around the risk society, how everything has become the risk, and how research now is all about identifying risk rather than anything else. The focus is on risk, how this and the risks, and how that risk society discourse shapes public health policy and health behaviours in the end of the year. So interesting view of current public health research, the risk society. Lifestyle factors, I said that, you know, if we individualise health status, then it's a way of removing responsibility from governments for doing something about health status in the community as a whole. Social inequality and health status, education and health status. So all of the above rest on theoretical assumptions about how the world works and about how we interpret the world. Qualitative research may also be about developing a curiosity about how things change. So, nice little ad from the 1950s. You mean a woman can open it? I use this sort of stuff because it's so easy, because it's everywhere on the net. And thinking that that's really old-fashioned, but if you look at from last year, a Bic pen ad. Look like a girl, act like a lady, think like a man, work like a boss. If you're a feminist researcher, you'd be looking at that language and saying, not a lot has changed. My boss.
There was also that campaign a few years ago called Bad Bossy. Was Bad Bossy or something else? It was bossy, something related to bossy, and people were just like, huh?
When, what was that in?
It was circulating around YouTube, but...
Oh, right, okay.
And I think UN were also involved in, I think it was UN planned it?
United Nations?
Yeah.
Don't know what that would be. Anyway, yeah. But probably a different message than this. Look like a girl, think like a man.
That's the worst thing.
What's that?
Saying Happy Woman's Day, a happy woman.
Oh, that's right.
That's the worst thing.
No, you're a happy woman if you look like a girl and think like a man. Yeah. And the fact that they say girl and man just...
That's a separate day.
Yeah, Happy Woman's Day, yeah. It's a bad ad all round. Bad ad. Lots of them. Another one from this. How do you clean stubborn spots off floors? Cleaning, that's a woman's job. To this, which is a very recent ad, using a woman as a clothes horse, yeah, basically, so not very good. I have to stop, but theory is important in how we ask research questions. So depending upon what your theoretical perspective is, and you'll get a sense of that when we talk about different approaches, but your theoretical, all your theorising is really important about how those questions are posed, and the context that is looked at. So they're just a number of examples. I won't talk very much about methods at all, because we'll talk in depth about methods as we're looking at different areas of qualitative inquiry. but theory also informs methods. So your theorising in your qualitative research informs every element of the research process. But we'll be looking at differing sampling methods, purposive, theoretical, how data is generated, always called data collection, but somebody I really like, one of the books I've got said, you know, data collection sort of sounds as though you're wandering around with a basket and you're picking up things and putting in the basket. So I now talk about data generation, that the researcher generates the data, doesn't just go and collect the data. And we'll talk about data analysis. There are different approaches to data analysis, again, which are theoretically driven. So theory is absolutely important. So excellence in qualitative research is about theoretically sound interpretation. It's not about, and when you read theoretical articles, you will see this a lot. I hope not a lot now, but it's not about presenting observational or interview data as fact. I think it's something to keep in mind. I mean, the samples in qualitative research tend to be quite small, so you could have maybe 15, 20, 30, 40. If you're doing interviews, 15, 20, 30, 40 interviews. If you did quantitative research with a sample of 15, you'd be laughed at if you tried to present the results as valid, just like that ethics board. But so I don't think we can do the same with qualitative research. I don't think we can just interview 15 people and present the data or what people say as somehow a mirror on reality. What we do with that data is that we work it and we theorise it, we interpret it, but we theorise it. We never should present qualitative data as a mirror on reality or as fact. So it isn't about getting inside people's heads, and it's not about conforming to a recipe, even though there are hundreds of people out there who've written qualitative methods texts setting out a recipe. It is about drawing on all forms of data, any form of data. It's about exploring and making known the way that human beings engage in the construction of meaning, and it's being literate about qualitative research and understanding what it means to be a qualitative researcher. So, lovely quote from a famous sociologist: theorisation may be understood as disciplined imagination. It's a really lovely way to put it. Key points. Anything can be qualitative data. Absolutely anything can be qualitative data. It's what we do, how we work that data that turns it into research. Rigour is critical. That means argument is critical. I'll talk more about that, but because I haven't said anything about it before, but that's probably an argument I put, that qualitative research is strongest when it's not constrained by methods. Good qualitative research, as people have said here today, is good qualitative research is about interpretation, so it should never be descriptive. It should never be about describing any situation or describing data. Key points, just to remember as we go on. Okay,